Crystal lights float above us like frozen stars, throwing soft sparks across the riverine hall. The room is so quiet it hums. Silk dresses whisper. Cufflinks click. I can feel the weight of every eye on my skin. My son, Kojo Komu, leans forward in his chair, lips curled, voice low enough to sting. You'll get nothing. He smiles at me as if the words are a gift. I fold my hands to stop the shake. The long table is crowded with relatives who have not called me in years, their faces bright with greed and fear. At the head sits Thando Juma, the estate lawyer, neat suit, calm gaze, one finger on a stack of papers worth more than this room and everything in it. He clears his throat. A single cough bounces off marble and glass. Somewhere a phone vibrates and goes still. I smell lemon polish and old money. Kojo glances at the cameras that are not there and still acts as if they are. He wants a stage. He wants a win. I keep my eyes on the lawyer. Thando clicks his pen. He speaks the figure, $59 million, and the air changes. Breath catches. Chairs creak. I can hear my heart, slow and stubborn. Kojo lifts his chin, already tasting victory. I do not move. I have stood in louder storms. The chandelier light trembles as if it knows what is coming. Thando looks at me, then at the room, and begins to read. Before the chandeliers and the lawyers there was Lahanga Market, and I can still see every small thing as if it were a photograph pressed to my palm. I remember the stall where I sold tomatoes and bitter leaf, the way the sun hit the tarpaulin in the morning and turned the air into a warm sigh. I remember the noise, the shouting and the laughter, the children running between boxes, the men arguing over prices like it was life or death. I remember the coins that slipped into my hand, one by one, like tiny promises. I rose before the birds to wash the day's buckets, tie my hair back, wrap a scarf around my shoulders, and walk the uneven road with a basket balanced on my head. Some days the basket was heavy with produce and light with hope. Some days it was light with produce and heavy with the weight of worry. I learned to bargain with my mouth closed and my eyes open. I learned to smile at customers who left without paying and to tuck away the pain so the children would not see it. No one saw the nights I sat on the floor with a candle and a small notebook, counting what I could spare. No one saw the times I skipped dinner so my children could eat warm food in the corner of our small house. I worked for others by day and mended torn shirts by night. I washed floors, scrubbed pots, and carried water that left my hands cracked and proud. Once, after a heavy rain, I walked home with wet shoes and a stubborn song in my throat because my baby had a fever and needed medicine I did not have. I borrowed from a neighbor then repaid with the first profit of a good sale. I held secret savings in an old biscuit tin under the bed and felt like a queen guarding treasure. I promised myself quietly that my children would never grow up knowing hunger as a constant friend. I promised that when the world turned its back we would still have each other. I taught them how to tie shoelaces, how to fix a torn book, how to say thank you even when their hearts were loud with anger. I told them stories about a future where they would not bow their heads for coins, where they would walk into rooms like this one with dignity. I kept a photograph folded in my apron of a man who once owed me a life debt, a soft paper that smelled of smoke where his handwriting said trust me. I hid it because even hope can be stolen if it is left out. Those years shaped me into someone who could stand in a grand hall with a steady face. They gave me patience that looked like quiet strength. They taught me that love can be the kind of work that does not stop, even when the world writes you off. The lawyer's voice had hardly settled when the room began to show its true face. Kojo leaned back with the swagger of a king who already owned the crown. His laugh was sharp, loud, the kind of sound meant to cut me down. We all know how this ends, he said, tapping his finger against the polished table as if he were keeping score. Beside him sat Esi Bahati, her dress glittering like she had dressed for a stage instead of a will reading. She tilted her head toward the lawyer with a smile too sweet, too sharp, the kind of smile that hides knives. Every time she looked at me, her eyes said, "You don't belong here." Across the table, Cousins I barely recognized whispered to each other, trading glances like cards, trying to guess who would leave rich and who would leave ruined. Someone coughed too loudly, and it sounded like laughter. At the far end, an uncle leaned forward, voice low, asking if the papers were real. Rumors had already begun to slip through the hall like smoke. Talk of forged codicils, secret edits, hidden letters. People muttered about bribes, about pages switched in the night. I saw two cousins clutch each other's arms as if they were holding a shared lie. Every face turned into a jury, eyes flicking to me, then back to the lawyer, measuring, waiting, judging. The air was thick with old grudges that no chandelier could brighten. I could feel debts hanging in the silence, debts unpaid for years, secrets that had been waiting for this moment to crawl into the light. A cousin who once borrowed money and never returned it would not meet my gaze. A woman who had mocked me in the market years ago now sat with lips pressed tight, afraid of what might be read next. The room no longer felt like a family gathering. It was a court without a judge, a theater without mercy. Kojo's voice rose again, mocking, reminding the room of his birthright, of bloodlines and promises. He wanted them to side with him, to see him as the rightful heir, the only true child worth the fortune. Esi nodded along, playing loyal, her smile catching on the edges of his pride. Behind their polished masks, I saw fear. Because deep down they knew the truth, money may choose its owner, but secrets choose their time. And tonight, the walls of Riverine Hall were ready to betray us all. The lawyer opened the papers and began to read in the flat, careful voice of someone who has said these words many times before. He spoke of properties with names that sounded like places in a storybook, the Dakari Island Holding, the old warehouse on Bloor Road, the Hill House in Chuma Heights. He named bank accounts and trusts, he said words like executors and beneficiaries, and each official phrase landed in the room like a small stone. People leaned in. I could see the way their eyes slid from the paper to me and back again, hungry to catch the moment they expected. The lawyer moved through the list the way a clock moves through minutes. He read about trusts set up for schools, for workers, for long-term care. He spoke of trustees and conditions, of money that could not be touched for years. The sentences were full of careful limits, as if the dead man wanted his money to have rules that would last longer than whoever argued about it. All of this sounded like a story that left one person at the edge. Then he read the line everyone had muttered about in whispers before the hall grew quiet enough to hear the clock. He said the word household and I felt a cold pinch in my chest. He described a small allowance, a token sent to the people who kept the house, a small sliver meant to close mouths and keep appearances. I watched faces change, as if the room had been holding its breath and now could breathe again, but only to breathe scorn. Kojo smiled like he had been right all along. Esi's hand came to her throat, as if to taste the victory. The cousins who had been trading glances now smirked and rearranged their chairs so they could be seen approving. Cameras would have loved this scene. The insult hung there, a neat little thing wrapped in legal language and meant to humiliate. The narrative people had already chosen for me played out exactly as they hoped. Humiliated, left with nothing, pushed to the margins where I had lived for years. I felt the room narrowing around me, every word pushing at old wounds until they throbbed. My throat pressed against a quiet promise I had made to myself in a market stall years ago. I could have reacted. Anger would have been honest. Tears would have been true. Instead I kept still and let the lawyer's voice fill the hall, cataloging a fortune and handing the room the last line of the story they wanted. The hush after his words was louder than any shout. People shifted, chewed on the small cruel prize of certainty, ready to turn the moment into gossip that would travel faster than truth. I kept my face plain, but inside the silence was a slow, steady heartbeat that would not be bought with a sliver meant for appearances. Thando lifted a sealed envelope as if the paper itself were a small, dangerous animal and the room held its breath with him. For a moment the hall was only the sound of his thumb on the paper, a soft click that felt louder than any shout. Then he broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet with hands that did not tremble. His voice became very clear, the kind of clarity that makes gossip stop and attention sit upright. He read the clause slowly, each word separate and heavy, that a trust was to be established for the benefit of Amara Como, that the trust was tied to a privately held concern on Dakari Island, that the trust would hold management rights and income until the estate's debts and obligations were met, and that I, Amara, was to be the primary beneficiary and named trustee in due course. The name sounded like a bell in the hush. For a beat Kojo's sneer stayed, but his jaw worked like someone trying to keep a door closed while they felt the wind push through. Faces around the table changed color the way clouds change before rain. Whispers that had been coiled like snakes uncurled into sharp, stunned gasps. ESI's hand dropped from her throat and her smile froze into something small and brittle. A cousin who had been sure of his inheritance let out a sound that was almost a laugh and then stopped. Phones came up, not to film but to check each other's faces, as if the news might be a mistake that could be corrected by looking again. Thando kept reading, and the paper gave more detail. The Dakari Island concern was not an empty plot or a named tax shield but a real business with shipping rights and contracts, a net of suppliers and clients, and a clause that forbade sale without the trustees' consent. It was precise in a way that left no easy attack. The clause even named 2 longtime employees as witnesses and placed a short cooling-off period before any challenge could proceed. That last line was like a lock on the room. Kojo's hand moved toward his glass, then hesitated. He had rehearsed his anger for cameras that did not need to be there. Now he looked small under the chandeliers. People who had been throwing rumors like confetti felt those rumors land and crumble. A murmur ran through the seats, a slow, spreading sound that was part disbelief and part the beginning of fear. I watched Kojo, not because I wanted to see him fall, but because the change in him was a language I knew well. Shock became a color on his face, then edged into fury, then stalled, because the paper on Thando's desk was not just words. It was legal weight and a testament written by a man who had no reason to lie from beyond the grave. For the first time that night, the hall saw me not as a rumor or a market woman, but as the name on a clause that could not be ignored. Kojo did not wait for the room to breathe. He sprang up like a man who had been holding his hate in for years and could not hold it any longer. He pointed at me with a shaking finger, voice rough with fury, shouting that the papers were forged, that this was a trick, that I had tricked the old man into writing my name. His supporters leaned in, mouths open, ready to cheer him on. ESI gasped and covered her mouth with 2 fingers, as if sound alone could hide guilt. For a moment the hall felt like a storm, lightning quick and loud. Then Thando set the envelope down and, calmly, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, reached into his briefcase and took out a thin packet of old paper tied with a faded ribbon. The air changed when he untied it. The papers smelled faintly of smoke and time. One by one he read short, steady lines. Letters written in a hand that trembled like a reed but was never weak, letters where Baraka Msimu thanked me for keeping his confidence during the hardest years, where he wrote of a debt he could never repay with money but could honor with a promise. Someone at the back made a sound like a broken thing. Then Thando held up a photograph, edges blackened as if it had been rescued from a small fire. The picture was half burned, but you could still see 2 hands, clasped, and a name written across the back in Baraka's careful script, for Amara, who kept my secret. A hush fell, heavy and slow. Kojo's face moved through colors, red, pale, then the look of someone who has lost his script and is forced to improvise. He shouted about bribery, about fake witnesses, and a cousin called for the papers to be tested. That was when an older man in the corner stood, a shipping foreman from Dakari Island, hair like winter grass, voice cut by years but steady. And said he remembered Baraka's visits, the late-night talks, and how Baraka had said Amara was the only person he trusted to care for what mattered. Another witness, the woman who had been Baraka's housekeeper long before I came, told of a time Baraka had hidden his ledger in my care after a threat from bad men. She nodded when Thando read the ledger's line that matched the letters. The room no longer had the easy confidence it began with. Papers and photographs are not gossip, they are proof that can be held up and shown. Kojo's accusations fell like loose coins, clinking without weight. He tried to raise his voice, but a murmur of belief had begun to move around the table like a tide. I did not clap or laugh. I kept my hands folded and my face simple. The truth had stepped into the light, and with it came a strange, quiet power that made people shuffle in their seats and reconsider the stories they had been telling themselves for years. The room changed into a place where truth and anger met and could not ignore each other. Thando kept his calm and did the work of a man who knows how to close a story properly. He called witnesses one after the other. A young accountant from Dakari Island spoke about the company books and how Amara had been named in old meeting minutes. An old friend of Baraka's told the story of the promise he made in a small house by the sea, a promise to put things right someday. Each person spoke in simple words, and each time a new paper or a ledger page was shown, another piece of the old puzzle fit into place. Kojo barked and reached for the papers, trying to shout over them, but every interruption only made the witnesses speak louder and clearer. He accused people of lying. He named law firms and paid experts. He asked for delays and tests. He tried to make the room tired so they would leave and forget. For a moment it looked like that could work because the cousins who wanted quick money looked sideways and worried. Then a clear voice from the back, a former employee who had worked with Baraka for years, told how Baraka had trusted Amara in a time when trust was dangerous. She said the burnt photograph was proof that the handwriting on the letters was Baraka's. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. The story used small, real things that could not be made up. Thando put documents on the table that matched the stories, each copy stamped and signed, and each witness confirmed the same facts. The law was present in the room and it lined up with the memory of people who had lived the truth. Kojo's plan to stop the reading fell apart like a bridge collapsing under too much weight. He looked around for support and found faces that had been cheering him now folding inwards. ESI's bright smile had faded into a tight line. The cousins who wore friendship like a cloak now shifted uncomfortably, as if the cloak had been set on fire. I stood up then, not because I wanted to claim a victory, but because I needed to be there for the truth. I spoke quietly, my voice steady. I said thank you to the witnesses, and I said the thing the room did not want to hear. I reminded them of the simple honesty of a promise and the cost of breaking it. I did not shout. I did not gloat. I looked at Kojo and at everyone who had judged me before they knew the facts. In that silence after my words, the weight of old wrongs settled down and people started to move in the way a jury does when it has to decide who is right. Justice in that room was not only legal papers and signatures. It was the slow return of fairness to a name people had tried to erase. Shame arrived like a low tide. Some faces were washed clean. Others were left with marks they could not hide. When the papers were finished and the last witness stepped down, the room felt different, as if a weight had shifted and a new shape had been carved into the air. The lawyer closed his folder and looked at me with something like relief, and I stood to speak, not to celebrate but to accept what had been given. I agreed to take charge of a community fund for Kibara City, a promise written into the trust that would pay for schools, clinics, and small loans for market women who work like I once did. I said I would not let the money become a weapon or a private prize. Kojo's face, once loud with certainty, sank into a smaller set of lines. Rumors that had fueled his boldness turned into news of investigations, people who had cheered him began to distance themselves. By the time the reporters left and messages began to light up across phones, the story had already started to spread beyond the hall. A son trying to steal a name, a woman who kept a hand to a promise, and a will that appended the family map. Legal papers were filed by those who felt wronged and by those who sought to test the trust, so Kojo faced not only shame but a path through courts and questions he could not answer with a sneer. I walked out of Riverine Hall with my coat wrapped tight and my step steady. Outside, the sunlight felt like a clean thing. People stood in small groups, some looking at me with new respect, others with the old suspicion that takes longer to die. I did not look back at the chandeliers or at the empty chair where his pride had been. I walked toward the street and toward the market I remembered, thinking of schoolbooks and clinic doors to open, knowing that the real change would be slow and hard. The last image the knight left was not of money counted, but of responsibility carried, and the crowd left behind them a clear line between who they were and who they must become.